Michael, it's our last two chapters.
It's been a very interesting book, and the last two chapters kind of make some conclusions.
It has not been fast.
No, it hasn't. Our podcasts have become better over time. I think we've gotten better at this. As I said in the beginning, I've never even heard a podcast before, and now we're doing one.
I'm kind of afraid they're going to do a survey. But it's not been fast. It's not been easy. I'm glad we did it.
I'm super glad that we did it. It hasn't been easy because these are some not pleasant truths that we've had to confront. These are some things that both of us have had a strong background in fair housing and equal opportunity. But I think both of us were surprised. I know I've been surprised by a lot of stuff that was going on in here. And I'll be honest, I would have said early on that there was some de jure segregation, but that most of it was de facto. And I was shocked to hear about how much of it was de jure. And in fact, one of the things that came up, and I don't want to get too ahead of us here, how schools are taught, how this is presented. I think the biggest shock to me was all the FDR, New Deal, and all that kind of stuff. I always thought that was very promotional to fair housing and to inclusionary practices. And in fact, it was not at all. It was not at all.
For everybody listening, in these next two chapters, we're going to be starting to kind of go into that territory of drawing some conclusions and getting into some opinion. But the first 10 chapters of this book, it was not about opinion. It was not about theories, it was just hardcore facts. Hardcore facts that Michael and I didn't even know. He gave, from beginning to end, so much facts and information, undisputable facts and information. It's beyond the pale.
You can't contradict what he said here. It is fact. And that's the part that, if I was growing up and reading and learning about history, and granted, I'm a little older than many people that are listening to this, and what was history for some people was current events for me. For example, the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968 and the passing of the Fair Housing Act just a couple of weeks later. In 1968, I was a high school senior. I mean, I was pretty much an adult by that time, so I was very well aware of these things. But a lot of the stuff that I thought I was aware, that I thought I knew, turned out not to be true at all. And part of that is because it's the way it's been presented to us.
So we're starting out with chapter 11, Michael, looking forward, looking back. Throughout this book, the book is about housing segregation, but obviously it's going to touch on other issues related to civil rights. Segregation that was a result of explicit and intentional government programs and policies. Trying to address that is going to be different than addressing the other civil rights issues like voting, transportation, and employment. From 1883 to 1968, 85 years, 50 years later, housing segregation still exists. So that was the time period he was running through. De jure segregation, government policy, 1883 to 1968, an 85-year history of government policy. And even after 1968, 50 years later, we're still seeing housing segregation. Fair Housing Act prohibited segregation moving forward, but there was no remedy for all of the past violations. Whereas like voting, okay, moving forward, you could quickly make ground by simply changing the law. Whereas with housing segregation, all the advantages of government zoning, FHA and VA loans only to white individuals in the 1940s and 50s, all of that ended up becoming almost permanent, as did unaffordability as a result of those things for African Americans.
It's easy to say you can ride anywhere on the bus as of today.
Yes.
It's easy to say you can eat in any restaurant, stay in a hotel as of today. And the voting situation. And there were still struggles. There were still people trying to find ways around and bad people out there still trying to not do those things. But that changed. It changed. But even though you could say, okay, we're not going to have segregated housing anymore and you can live anywhere you want, but the reality is they couldn't. Because of the history of the segregation, they couldn't live anywhere they wanted because they didn't have the financial means to do that, because they had lost out on the ability to gain generational wealth. They lost out on the ability to build equity in their homes. And I don't remember what the year was,
So it's 1948, Levittown, 1948, a single-family home was $75,000 in today's dollars. So in Levittown, 1948, a single-family home sold for $8,000 or $75,000 today. So moving forward, today, if you were to sell that same home, it would sell for about $350,000 or more. So if you were a white family and you bought in Levittown back in 1948, your family wealth in that equity grew by over $200,000. But African Americans in Levittown who were denied the right to own had to rent, often in depressed neighborhoods. If they were able to buy a home in a less desirable area, there was Lakeview nearby, and the book talked about the Meriday family, they gained $45,000.
Over the same period of time.
In the same period of time in equity. And that's if they did not end up becoming a victim of the subprime targeting that ended up taking those homes from a vast majority of African American families. So $200,000 in generational wealth accumulated just in equity, or $45,000.
So significant. Mm-hmm. It became to the point where it's like, oh, well, we don't discriminate on the basis of race anymore, but you have to afford to be able to live here. African American families didn't have an opportunity to build that wealth. And I think most of our listeners as realtors understand that you buy a starter home, you live there for a while, you build some equity in it, then you move up to the next level, and then you move up to the next level, and over time that continues to grow. And they never had a chance to even get started on it.
So this example is just the bare minimum, $200,000 versus $45,000.
Yes.
You're right. This is if they stayed in that exact same home and didn't continue to use that equity to leverage themselves higher
into better neighborhoods. But you have to have a start. You have to be able to start somewhere. And that was the thing about the fact that the de jure segregation that we had previously precluded African American families from ever getting that start. So you can say, well, we don't have it today. And ironically, we kind of still do have it today. Not so much blatant de jure segregation, but we certainly have the de facto segregation that is a direct result of the de jure segregation.
The other thing that's very important in this book, and we'll talk about it more, but housing is not an island of itself. It impacts so many other aspects of a person's life. It impacts where you get a job many times, what kind of job you have. It impacts your social structure. It's not just about the roof over your head or equity. It also impacts, and this is a really, really big one, it impacts education. School segregation and housing segregation are linked. Schools, the book highlights, the author highlights, are more segregated today than they were 40 years ago, because our schools and how they're set up and who attends which school and the quality of education of that school is completely linked to the location of that school and the wealth of the area around it. There are a number of things, and we're going to go through them, why housing segregation is hard to undo. Prolonged economic suppression, lack of housing appreciation and generational wealth. We waited too long, and now homes are less and less affordable in real dollars. We've continued, quote unquote, race-neutral policies like taxation that are not necessarily de jure segregation anymore, but they reinforce the existing issues of housing segregation, and government policies that continue to promote renting in segregated areas.
You get tax benefits from owning property. You get to deduct the interest and get to deduct the taxes, property taxes you pay, etc., whereas black families didn't have that opportunity.
Let's talk about the income gap.
Okay.
In its relation to housing. So, end of World War II to 1973, the author talks about how real wages and family incomes for middle class nearly doubled. It was the industrial boom, from manufacturing to housing, construction, highways, so many jobs being created. No, African Americans were excluded from many jobs, especially higher paying blue collar occupations. So African American incomes didn't truly start rising until the 1960s. And by that time, suburbanization was almost complete. Not only were they not allowed to buy into many nice neighborhoods and buy single-family homes, but by the time their incomes caught up to middle-class white Americans and they were able to get the same types of jobs without being discriminated against, we're going to talk about how much more homes had appreciated.
The housing became out of reach.
Real wages, and housing was out of reach.
You know, and the other thing, too, that you mentioned, you touched on a second ago, and that was, let's say, for example, that an African-American during World War II or after World War II in the post-war boom had a job that paid the same as the white person that was working next to him. But he really didn't make as much money because he had to spend more time getting to and from the job and spend more time on transportation because he had to go live in a segregated area that was farther away from the job. So even then, even the real income that they were getting was not as much.
Yep. So that was World War II to 1973. Then the book outlines 1973 to present. Incomes then stagnated for all races, or they declined if you only had a high school education. Just as we said, single-family homes start to soar. The black median wage fell by 1% as home prices grew by 43%. Then in the next decade, wages fell for African Americans by another 1% as home prices grew by 8%. So we're talking about, over those 2 decades, a 50% increase in home values as real wages declined by 2%. That income in being held back from being able to start rising in income and occupation is tied to housing, even once now they're able to even be allowed.
As you said earlier, we waited too long. It took too long to get to that point. By the time they got there were no longer the color barriers, but there was the financial barrier, and the financial barrier was unattainable, unsurmountable for black Americans because of the color barrier previously.
Yeah. So the thing going through my head is, thanks for nothing. So
that's a quote from Caddyshack.
Yeah.
Thanks for nothing.
So lack of social mobility. So we have income, and that relates to social mobility. And I love how the author explains, we talk about the American fantasy. That children, not the American dream, no, it is the American fantasy, that children born to low-income families can themselves escape that status. And fill in the blanks with me, everybody. We all know the mantra: hard work, responsibility, education, ambition, and a little luck. The U.S., in fact, in actuality, has become less mobile than many other industrialized societies. Only 30% of children born to parents in the lowest earning quintile make it to the middle quintile or higher. That means 70% of children born to low-income parents will never even make it to the middle class. Now, we're talking about everybody. That's even less for African Americans. The results of segregation, poor access to jobs, in quality schools and education where they could excel, was stripped from them in this American quote-unquote dream.
One sentence in there that I thought summed up this entire chapter, looking forward, looking back. It says the advantage of FHA and VA loans that were given to the white lower middle class in the 40s and 50s have become permanent. Mm-hmm. So, and that's where you said before about waited too long. You got the advantage in the 40s and the 50s. You never got a chance to catch up.
I compare it to running a race where you have held the entire African American population back from the starting line to get to the pot of gold. And by the time you sound the whistle for them, it's all gone.
Yeah, exactly.
So the author, I think, also makes an important distinction between income and wealth. Median income today is about $60,000. For African Americans, it's about $37,000. For most of the population, white population, median wealth, here's where there's even a bigger gap, is $134,000. But for African Americans, median wealth is only $11,000. So that intergenerational wealth and mobility is even less for wealth than it is for income. And why is that important?
Because what's wealth tied to for most people? Their home. Mm-hmm. It's usually the biggest asset they have. As real estate agents, we talk to people all the time about the fact that this is the biggest investment that many people have, the biggest asset that many people have. And regardless of who you are, it's one of your biggest assets. And that's where a lot of your wealth is tied up, is in your home. And guess who never had a chance to have the home?
There's the example of inheritances and people being able to be able to take an inheritance that's given to them from a grandparent or parent, and whatever they do with it, is as long as they're not complete idiots with it, whether they invest it, in stocks or in real estate, but then they compound that generational wealth if they invest it wisely. And yet, even today, in the housing market we're in, I think this is something all of us have to look at through this new lens, is you have horrible supply issues, you have multiple bids, and what is helping get people ahead of the pack when it comes to being able to get their offer accepted over others? It is a combination of being able, to outbid them, but it's also potentially cash that they're able to bring to the table. I'm sure every single real estate agent and broker out there listening can think of very specific examples of transactions where a person, what made the difference for them was that they had a parent helping them out, giving them money for down payment, or being able to give them more cash to be able to make a cash offer, and then they paid their parent back rather than the bank. But those types of people, if you don't have any equity, you're a first-time home buyer, if you don't have any parents or grandparents giving you inheritances or helping you make down payments, you are, again, even at 2024, at a significant disadvantage of becoming a homeowner because of this prolonged history of housing segregation.
It's probably truer today for across the board of all races, of all people, than ever before that you need help to get into the housing market. But it's even more true for African Americans because of the long-term effects of the gender segregation that existed basically from the Civil War right up until through the 60s and 70s.
So the author, again, is starting to pose questions to us. So we're an equal opportunity society, right? It's what we've all been taught. It's our mantra. It's what we want to believe. But let's look at the true definition, he says, is of what makes an equal opportunity society. It would mean that no matter what the wealth is of your parents, you have just as much chance as an adult to end up anywhere in the wealth distribution. But the fact is, nearly one half, about 41% of all children born to parents in the least wealthy fifth of American families, the 1/5, remain in that lowest quintile as adults. Almost half. And another 25% make it to the very next lowest quintile. Only 1/3 make it as high as the middle class. We are not an equal opportunity society. Hard work, education, diligence is not enough for at least 70% of individuals to be able to move past your social status that you were born into.
Even the race-neutral policies that we have in effect today still have disparate impact on African Americans.
We're going to get into government policy, which is another reason he talks about it's so hard to overcome the past of housing segregation. But more statistics. We're going to inundate you until it's undeniable. New York professor by the name of Patrick Sharkey wrote a book called Stuck in Place. And he found that African Americans, now we are talking about people in general, but it's even more pronounced for African Americans. African Americans that are 13 to 28 years old are now 10 times more likely to live in poor neighborhoods as whites. 66% of African Americans are likely to live in poor neighborhoods compared to 6% of whites. That is one statistic demonstrating the lingering and permanent effect of housing segregation. 48%, almost half of African American families at all income levels, have lived in poor neighborhoods for over 2 generations, compared to only 7% of white families. And he talks about the consequences of this again. Consequences of growing up in a poor neighborhood are greater than just being poor. We're talking about fewer adult role models, poorer schools, more violence, fewer summer job opportunities, fewer libraries, bookstores, less medical care, less fresh food. We call them food deserts. Instability from parental unemployment. And as somebody who has been involved with this and done a lot of studying of my own as a foster parent, etc., the number one, hands down, contributor to child abuse and child neglect is stress from poverty. So all of a sudden, you significantly increase instability of unemployment, poverty, not enough food and resources to provide for a family. And what that does is it significantly increases the chances of additional problems for that child in the form of abuse and neglect. And then you add on top of all of that the effects of pollution on health. Another reason, Michael teased on it, why we can't just move forward. We can't get out of the hole we dug for housing segregation easily is because of government policy. The cycle of poverty and segregation can be broken only, the author says, by policies that are as aggressive as that which created the ghettos of concentrated poverty in the first place. So here's a new term we're going to introduce you to. It's called disparate. Race-neutral policies that reinforce disadvantages for African Americans will either exacerbate or reverse, but they will never be neutral. So policies such as, like Michael mentioned, mortgage interest deduction, our transportation system, how much money, significant money, we will pour into highway improvements, but not public transit. And everybody who's listening, I know what you're thinking, okay? It's Happy Valley. Public transportation works goofy here, okay? We are not a high-density urban area. So when we're talking to you about transportation issues, I want you to get out of your mind of Green Bay and Appleton and Oshkosh. I want you to think about what it is like to live in major urban metropolitan areas, Chicago, New York, everywhere from San Francisco to all of our major metropolitan areas, DC, when you cannot afford to own a car. How do you get anywhere? How do you get to jobs? How do you get to stores? How do you get to daycare for your children? So when there is not enough buses and there are not enough bus routes, especially outside of the very inner cities, allowing you to move to nicer rings around the area because there is no transportation. And they tell you there's no money for that. But then they will pour tons, billions of dollars into highway improvements and expansions for everybody else in the very outer rings who are able to afford cars. That has what the author is talking about, disparate impact on African Americans than it has on whites. Low-income housing tax credits, housing choice vouchers, and gentrification. These are all examples.
Even things as simple as sales tax. Sales tax affects everybody. It's race neutral. You buy something, you pay sales tax on it. But it affects poor people more distinctly and more profoundly than it does wealthy people. Okay, that's still race neutral, that poor people are affected more by sales tax. However, what did we just say? How many times more likely is it for a black family to be poorer than a white family in today's world because of the fact that they were not able to generate long-term wealth, because they weren't able to accept jobs that they could have accepted, because an awful lot of the specific de jure segregation that's existed over the years. So what happens there, you go, well, it affects all poor people the same, except it has a disparate impact on black families because there are more poor black families. Redlining is a good example of disparate impact. When you go draw a line and go, well, we can't provide loans in this area because we have a high rate of people declining on payment, defaulting. Or we can't provide insurance in this area because there's a high level of claims in that place. And you go, and it's race neutral. We're just drawing a red line around this area saying this is a problem. We don't even know who lives there. But if it has a disparate impact on a particular class of people, such as African Americans, then that's considered to be discriminatory.
Well, that would be true of disparate impact if they didn't know who lived there. Redlining was created because they knew exactly.
They did know who lived there,
that was
but their claim was, oh, really? No, look at this. This is just where the high defaults are. This is just where the high claims are. Then you look at it and go, yes, but it has a disparate impact on one particular class. Therefore, it is discriminatory in effect. It's segregation in its effect. And that's where the disparate impact comes into play on all these different issues.
So the author also talks about low-income tax credits. So I'm in the midst of these conversations a lot with our housing providers.
Yep.
We're in the middle of a housing crisis, and right now it is house on fire for them. It is triage. And they are just trying to figure out, with very little resources, how they're going to keep not only housing currently people who have nowhere to live, but the flood of people that are continuing every day to come through their doors because of the housing crisis. There's not time or energy to think a lot about bigger picture implications of the low-income housing tax credit. We celebrate, even here locally, well, maybe not all of you, a lot of us celebrate when we do see now and then some low-income housing projects go up because of the need. But what they're seeing around the country is disparate impact. We are furthering segregation because those tax credits are going to developers that are putting these housing units back into depressed and segregated areas for a number of reasons. And number one, to make the math work, to keep those units affordable, they're having to buy land where it's cheapest. And that oftentimes is land in the most least desirable areas, which is usually where we have stuck the African American community to begin with. So we're not getting them out of where they're at by building these units. Or when a developer is able to potentially propose a project somewhere that would be in a better location and get them out of a depressed or segregated area, well, guess who shows up to those public hearings to kill it? So a lot of the new projects for low-income people, which disproportionately affects African Americans, is just self-perpetuating this problem of concentrating poverty and concentrating, especially our African American community, into really dense, undesirable areas. And the author gives the same example with the housing choice vouchers. Anybody trying to help low-income individuals are screaming and crying for the government to put more money in and to provide more vouchers. The waiting lists are ridiculous. If you have a million people right now that you provide housing vouchers for by the federal government, they have a waiting list of 6 million people who actually would qualify based on their income for those vouchers.
And by the way, this is referred to as Section 8 housing.
Section 8 housing. But even if the government doubled or tripled the amount of money in vouchers available, I'm not sure it'd make much difference because no one wants to rent to Section 8. And especially housing or rental units that are in nicer areas. The money they get from the Section 8 voucher will never cover what it costs. It will never fill the gap in the cost to rent to a basic market rate apartment or single family home in an area that is not in a depressed
I'll tell you, when I first started
neighborhood.
teaching fair housing for orientation for new agents, I was not aware that Section 8 housing was, that you could say we don't do Section 8 housing. I thought that would be discrimination. So I was surprised to find that out. That was in the 90s. It's still the case today in Wisconsin that you don't have to accept Section 8 housing, and that's not considered to be discrimination. There are some areas around the country where landlords have been prohibited from refusing to accept Section 8 housing, and maybe that's something that needs to be looked at more broadly.
Well, it's coming to Wisconsin, and I can tell you right now, our organization would oppose that. I'm in the middle of conversations right now about how do we provide fail-safes for landlords, hold harmless provisions for landlords who will rent to Section 8. Because here's the situation, everybody. There is an attachment to Section 8, and in our area, we don't have many minorities. But there is definitely a stigma nonetheless attached to low-income and Section 8 housing. Just because you're poor or you have a Section 8 voucher doesn't mean you're going to be a bad tenant. It doesn't mean you're going to be a bad neighbor to people living in that area. But here's the reality of it. First of all, when people have nothing to lose, you can sometimes see it in tangential ways of how they live. But we'll go back to, especially for African Americans, why is it again they have nothing to lose? Why is it again that they are so economically depressed? Is it really bad decisions on their part? No, we just covered all that. The other issue is if you have for generation after generation only lived in very, very poor, depressed neighborhoods where people didn't own their property, they didn't know how to take care and maintain their property. They never even witnessed it. There was never any money or time to do it. There was never an incentive to take good care of your property. They didn't know how to be good neighbors. It was survival of the fittest, one generation after another. It's a learning process. The question is not how do we keep Section 8 low-income individuals out of our neighborhood? The question should be, how do we help Section 8 people learn how to become good homeowners, good renters, good neighbors? And how do we get out of this pocket where we have so many individuals who have nothing to lose?
The one last thing the chapter closes up with is gentrification, which has always fascinated me. That not only did we segregate areas, now we decided, we want those places after all, take them back. You think about that on a small scale, a house here and a house there, or a small block here, a small block there. But then you see a picture here in the chapter, and it shows them tearing down an entire housing project in St. Louis so they can redevelop it. Now, where did all those people have to go when they tore that down? They all had to go to areas that were even more segregated than the place that they were in.
But Michael, that's called progress. That's revitalization. Who can argue with revitalization
and progress? Progress for some.
Revitalization for some.
It reminded me of us moving Native Americans into an area like Oklahoma, because who would want to live in this stinking desert?
Or Florida,
and then
the
finding
swamp.
out the swamp of Florida, and then finding out, there's oil here. Sorry, got to move you again.
Got to move you again.
So that was the kind of thing that it kind of reminded me of gentrification. Kind of reminded me of, oh, we'll put you here. Oh, we kind of like it here ourselves. We'll have to put you somewhere else.
So everybody, we have one last chapter. It is chapter 12, Considering Fixes. And the author starts again to start posing some questions to us, starting with, what are the consequences of not addressing racial segregation and the impact that it has had for the last 100 years on an entire population in our society, impacting everything from interracial politics, creating overly intolerant, judgmental people. It impacts productivity in this country. And as we mentioned before, it impacts education. And for those of you who are listening and have a puzzled look on your face of like, well, what are you talking about? Look around. This country is a powder keg. We are more racially divided in this country than we ever have been before. There are a lot of people out there that are talking about and starting to fear another civil war in this country. Us sticking our head in the sand and ignoring what has happened in our history and its continuing consequences is going to lead us into even worse problems potentially than we've even seen before. The author says you can start with just some basic changes. And I'll quote him, remedies that undo nearly a century of de jure residential segregation will have to be both complex and imprecise. After so much time, we can no longer provide adequate justice to the descendants of those whose constitutional rights were violated. Our focus can be only to develop policies that promote an integrated society, understanding that it will be impossible to fully untangle the web of inequality that we've woven. And what are just basic changes he's talking about? He's talking about full employment policy, minimum wages that return to a historic level and then keep up with inflation, and providing transportation for jobs. That is like just the bare minimum of what can be done, especially in our political climate. And the author is not naive to look around our country. And he's not talking about what we should be doing. He's very realistic about what is even possible right now. Nothing, not even basic minimum changes, are possible as long as we continue to be in a state of denial. He says remedies are inconceivable as long as citizens, whatever their political views, continue to accept the myth of de facto segregation, the myth that segregation just happened because, well, black people don't want to live near white people. They all want to live together. Or, well, that's just a consequence of people's racial preferences. It happened over time kind of by accident or by the will of the people, not the government. He says, but if we, the public and policymakers, by the way, that is the American society. We are the government. If we, the public and policymakers, acknowledge that the federal, state, and local governments segregated our metropolitan areas, then we may open our minds to considering how those same federal, state, and local governments might adopt equally aggressive policies to desegregate.
One of the things he talks about, too, is the fact that if we cannot educate people in school about how we got where we are, we're unlikely to be able to get away from where we are today.
But, Michael, that makes our kids feel bad. When we talk about systemic racism, and by the way, everyone, systemic racism is where all of our institutions and governments work together to design policies and frameworks that create discrimination, which is what the author has just systematically proven in the last 10 chapters of this book. If we talk about systemic racism in our schools and teach about what has happened, it makes kids feel bad.
I saw one little quote here from one of the textbooks they use in high schools. It says, in the North, too, African Americans faced segregation, discrimination. Even where there were no explicit laws, de facto segregation, or segregation by unwritten custom or tradition, was a fact of life. That's absurd.
That was a 2016 American textbook.
If I read that growing up, I would have thought, oh, so my feelings about the New Deal, and I had no idea that when they established FHA, that didn't apply to black families. That only applied to white families. So all of these unwritten customs and traditions is absurd. They were very much written. They were very much policy, and they were very much established by the government.
Here's another favorite quote of mine from an American textbook. A number of New Deal programs concerning housing and home mortgage problems. The Homeowners Loan Corporation provided government loans to homeowners who faced foreclosure because they couldn't meet their loan payments.
If you were white.
In addition, the 1934 FHA continues to furnish loans for home mortgages and repairs today. And they give Levittown as an example, a positive example, of FHA and VA suburbanization without disclosing that African Americans were excluded. So he calls it false history. I call it a lie. And it's no wonder people are brought up thinking that current conditions are a result of personal decisions and that any programs are handouts. I recently had an encounter with a news article that talked about the extreme gap between African Americans and whites in this country. And this person became so angry that I shared an article, a news article on this, saying that all that is a result of poor parenting and decisions. Again, buying into this understanding that all of this happened without any influence by institutions and government from the very beginning. We're not going to ever get past this if we're not even teaching the truth in our schools.
The old saying is, those who ignore history are destined to repeat it. Well, it's not even a matter of ignoring it. It's a matter of not even being told what it is. Right. We can't make progress if we don't know what got us here, so to speak. We need to be disabused of the de facto myth of segregation, which I think this book does a good job doing. I grew up in Detroit. Okay, I'm not in Detroit, but in the Detroit area. One of the governors of Michigan was George Romney. And I was like George Romney. Frankly, when I was growing up, in high school, I had a summer job, after-school job, working at a toy store. Maybe not surprising to many people if they know me. They know that I had this history of working at a toy store. It was a very small, custom toy store that was owned by one individual. And every once in a while, he'd nudge me. Someone would come in the door and he'd go, Michael, it's Mrs. Romney. It's Mrs. Romney. And I would go, I'd grab my pad and go, well, Mrs. Romney, how can we help you today? And I would follow around. She would, well, we have a birthday party. I need this for an 8-year-old. I need that, whatever. And I would go around and I would make notes of everything. And we go, I'll have that delivered to you by Saturday. And then we would package it all up and wrap it and put it in the station wagon. And I'd drive it over to the house and drop it off. This is, in fact, Mitt Romney's mother, by the way, if anybody's interested in knowing that. But George Romney was her husband. He was governor of Michigan. He was also head of American Motors at one time. And then under Nixon, he became the HUD secretary. And it said in here that George Romney tried to pursue integration more vigorously than any other administration, either before or since. Now, this was in 1970, so we still had the assassinations of both Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy fresh in our mind.
He called it open communities.
They're talking about trying to bring the concept back today. Oh. And it was brought in under Obama administration. But it made me feel very good to know that one of my personal, I won't call him a hero, but one of the people I looked up to when I was growing up was, in fact, took a positive approach. But how did it affect George Romney? He was overruled by President Nixon. He was dismissed as HUD and basically lost his job because they said, we can't be doing this kind of crap.
So the audacious thing he tried to do under open communities was just tell local governments, you're not going to get a whole bunch of federal money for things like water and sewer and green space and sidewalks if you still have exclusionary zoning policies. It wasn't fining them. It wasn't telling them they can't do things. They're just saying, we would call it a carrot approach. You want federal funds, just get rid of your exclusionary zoning policies. Well, this angered Republicans so much that they ended up calling on Nixon to end the program and get rid of him.
Ended the program and eventually forced him out of office.
So the next program, the next time anybody in government tried to take steps to have some kind of teeth to dig ourselves out of this perpetuating hole that we've dug, was HUD again under the Obama administration, and something every single one of you should be very familiar with, called affirmatively furthering fair housing. And this policy said that local governments must assess disadvantaged populations and identify goals to remedy segregated conditions. Were there any real teeth? No. It wasn't ever tied to federal funds. It never even got that far. In 2017, congressional Republicans proposed legislation to prohibit enforcement of the rule, and it died there. Well, it's not surprising that not many years after that, there were a number of police shootings and other examples from 2016 to 24 presidential election, revealing that the nation is almost evenly divided between those who feel like we've done too much and those who feel like we've done little to remedy racial inequality.
Post-Fair Housing Act of 1968, and much more recently in 1968, there's still that attitude that, well, people are happiest with their own kind. We shouldn't try to force people to integrate if they don't want to. The reality is, it's not a matter of making it that decision. It's a matter of not being able to. It's a matter of having the effect of long-term past discrimination.
But it also takes bravery. You do have to provide incentives at this point, Michael, because who's going to want to go into neighborhoods where you are discriminated against, where you're not wanted, where you are treated poorly, where your kids are not going to be allowed to be invited or play with the street hockey or kickball at the park because they're black?
When I was in high school in a suburb of Detroit, our school had a population of about 1,000 people, and we had one black student. His name was Harold. I often thought about that. What would I feel like if I was the only white student in a school where everybody else was black?
And we're considered inferior because of it.
In this particular setting, nobody really considered Harold inferior.
Nobody?
I shouldn't probably say that, nobody. Nobody openly said that, and Harold was pretty much immersed into our entire society. He was a lead singer in one of the high school rock bands, garage bands, and everybody liked Harold, pretty much everybody did. But that's because he's one black person in a school of 1,000 kids.
Not very threatening.
Outgoing, open, jolly personality. He was a happy guy. Everybody got along with him. He got along with everybody.
He had to be that way.
He had to be that way. And I don't think that, I certainly didn't look down on him. In fact, most of the time from my standpoint, I never even thought of him being black or white or anything else. He was just Harold. But again, that's a unique situation.
I was going to say, if only that was the story of everyone.
Absolutely. If only that was the story of everyone. But it made me think, though, even at the time, it made me think, what if I was the only white person in a school of all black students? Or what if I was the only white person in a community of all black people? I would feel a little, like you said, it's a little intimidating. So even though integration may be available, and you say, well, people should be allowed to live where they want to live. Obviously, they're just more happier with their own kind. It may be out of fear. It may be out of intimidation. It may be because the last time somebody tried that, they had crosses burned in their yard. It is interesting that the comments here are talking about Levittown and Lakeview, neighboring town of Lakeview, and they say that Lakeview is still like almost 90% African American, segregated. Mm-hmm. You know what? The recent Newsday investigation on Long Island is a good indication that part of the reason it still remains so segregated is because of us as realtors, guilty of steering, very blatant steering in many cases. To say, oh no, you don't want to move there. That's like the United Nations down there, if you know what I mean. Comments that were made during that investigation made me very sad to hear the fact that those things were still going on today. And by today, this was done 3 or 4 years ago now. Actually, probably 4 or 5 years ago at this point.
And
but nonetheless, it's still today. It's still happening today.
And there's still countless examples that are still happening of African Americans who are having their homes significantly undervalued in appraisals
We
for
talked
no
about
other
that in a
reason
previous
than-
chapter,
yep.
but it's still happening today. Problems still exist, and unfortunately, we've been part of the problem in the past because of our code of ethics that prohibited us from helping integrate neighborhoods, but we're still part of the problem today. Even when our code of ethics says we can't do those kinds of things, it's still happening. So we have to take some responsibility for what's gone along with that. Even though we're not a governmental agency, that's sort of quasi de jure segregation in addition to what the government was doing.
The author talks about if we're going to just wait around for everyone to have a change of heart in their biases or even just their outright hatred of minorities and African Americans, we're never going to make any progress. I want to share an interesting story that I thought was put very well. I was actually at a National Association of Realtors conference, and we were specifically talking about steering and the discrimination that's happening still with appraisals of property and what the National Association can do within our ranks to do more, to set a better example. And there was an African American realtor, and she made this analogy. She said, we'll talk about real estate because that's what we all do. So if you inherit a house and that house is broken, it's a mess. The roof needs to be repaired. People have punched holes in the wall. They've torn up the flooring. Plumbing is been ruined. Tons of work needs to be done on the house. You don't say, well, I didn't do these things. Why should I have to fix the house? You just do it because the house needs to be fixed.
That's where we are.
We have a lot of people in this country, maybe a lot of people listening to this podcast, who all along, as we've been leading to this point, have thought to themselves, it's really unfortunate that that happened in this country and happened to African Americans. What does that have to do with me? I didn't do these things. What do you expect me to do about it? Why do I have to pay the debt of my fathers? Well, the author's making the case of de jure segregation for a reason. Because whether we were around or not, we are the government, and the effects of government are lingering. If somebody is sent to prison and it can be proven that it was because they were railroaded there with false testimonies and police corruption or prosecutorial corruption, we give them at least some money. We try to compensate them for the years that we stole unjustly in their civil rights that we violated. We're the Realtors Association. We're the only proponents pounding on the table for compensation for private property rights. Government takes something for you, by God, you better pay them. You better compensate them from what you took from them. Well, we're the government.
Fifth Amendment.
We are the government. We stole housing wealth, income wealth, generational wealth for generations of African Americans for no other reason than the color of their skin. And there is a debt to be paid, and there is no one around to pay it but us. The author talks about remedies. Dare to dream is what I call this section. And he just floats out some ideas. There could be 1,000 ideas. But what if, just imagine, what if the government, in certain areas where there was huge segregation, they bought up houses and then they resold them to African Americans today at a rate they could have afforded when they were excluded by FHA and VA's discriminatory requirements. For instance, we go back to Levittown, the example. In today's dollars, a house would have cost $75,000. What if we sold them one of these houses for $75,000? Then they can not only live in it, they can integrate neighborhoods, but when they sell it, they suddenly get some of the equity that generations of white people have been able to enjoy. What if we had incentives for middle-income African Americans to integrate into largely white areas, especially those that have been historically racially exclusive? What if we had a ban on zoning ordinances that prohibit multifamily housing, or that all single-family housing has to be on large lots and minimum square footage? We right now, as an organization, Wisconsin, are trying the carrot approach, trying to get local governments to get rid of these types of policies from their ordinances voluntarily. But this author's saying, why? Why don't we just ban it? We all know what those ordinances are about, what their goals are about, and what the implications and effect are on African Americans. What if we ban mortgage interest deduction for communities that aren't taking steps to attract low and moderate housing? The 1993 Fair Share Act, John Berger University in North Carolina proposed this, trying to motivate us. It's not hurting us. Not a lot of motivation for us to protest policies that actually aid us rather than hurting us. How do you motivate us to start advocating for our local communities to start providing more options for housing for individuals? It's very hard to do, though, like in our area where the ratio of African Americans is so low. But especially other areas of the state, you get at the point that waiting for people to have a change of heart is never going to happen. You have to make the status quo not work so well for white people. And then there's inclusionary zoning, which we oppose, by the way. And I can argue this both ways, because inclusionary zoning essentially says, developer, if you're going to create an apartment or you're going to create a subdivision, a certain number of those units have to be reserved for middle income, a certain number have to be reserved for low income. Madison tried it, and we'll give you more units to make up for the loss of what you sell those or rent those for. But the problem is, we all still have such huge bias against anybody who's a minority or even people who are low income. They couldn't even rent those units that had low income options next to them. So they never rented them at all. They created them and they ate them and never even bothered selling them or bothered renting them so that they could keep all of their rich white privileged people buying and renting. And also there's the argument of, we all owe this debt, not just developers and people who own apartment buildings. They shouldn't be the only ones solving this problem on their own. We all need to be contributing to try and fix this problem. But there's 1,000 different ideas out there, but none of them are ever going to work if we still have that mentality of, yeah, the house is broken. I didn't break it. Why should I have to fix it?
The concept here is, first we have to recognize that something has to be fixed. Mm-hmm. We have to recognize that the house is broken. We have to recognize that we can't continue to live in a house that's like this.
And it wasn't an accident. The house didn't break on accident.
Then the next step is, what are we going to do to fix it? And using that same analogy, I may not be able to afford to go out and fix it all at once. I may not be able to afford to put on new siding and replace all the windows and doors and put the new roof on all at the same time. So maybe we have to take this a step at a time. Maybe we have to take different approaches. Getting where we are took a long time, and it was heavily engineered by government rules and regulations, thus de jure segregation. To fix it is not going to be overnight, but it needs to have heavy government involvement as well. And it may be along the lines of zoning rules that can have an impact on things. My grandfather used to say, it's the job that's never started that takes longest to complete. Usually because they want me to cut the lawn. And you better get going on this. If we don't get started on this, it's never going to get done. So I think there has to be some direction. And I think one of the things he talks about here is, I don't have a solution. There's some ideas, some things that have to get done, but they are complex and imprecise. But we need to do something. We need to move it. We need to get it going. We need to get something headed out in the right direction.
We're done with the official chapters of the book, but we've had a lot of material here, and we are going to do one final podcast where Michael and I kind of do a wrap-up and talk a little bit more about how do we take everything that we've learned here and move forward.